Oh hi. Cuba. The island state in Latin America, in the Caribbean region. It is located on the islands of Cuba, Juventud, and on more than 1,600 small islands of group of the Big Antilles. The archipelagos of Sabana, Los Canarios, Los Colorados, Camagüey, Jardines de la Reina, islands of San Felipe, etc. In the east it is washed by the Atlantic Ocean, in the south the Caribbean Sea. From North America it is separated in the west by Yucatan Channel, in the north the Florida Strait. Unitary state. The capital and the largest city, Havana. Monetary unit peso. From 1994 to 2021 I was in the address converted by peso. Official language Spanish. Cuba, the member of the Union. 1945. The non-aligned movements. 1961. The Organizations of the Caribbean States. 1994. The World Trade Organization. 1995. The name Cuba has origin in nowadays dead languages of the Indians secretly inhabiting the Big Antilles. The exact sense of the name isn't clear. There is a point of view that it can designate the place where the fertile earth is plentiful. Cuba. The wonderful place. Cobana. There is also a hypothesis that Christopher Columbus called the island in honor of the settlement Cuba around Beja in Portugal. Cuba is located on a joint of North, Central and South America, at the island of Cuba, the largest in West Indies. The Isle of Youth, and also on about 1,600 small islands and coral reefs belonging to a group of the Big Antilles adjoining them. Deep gulfs and a set of comfortable bays are characteristic of the coast. The island is framed with reefs and other coral educations. The area of Cuba -110, 860 km. The island stretched from the west on the east on 1250 km is quite often compared to a lizard whose head is turned to Atlantic, and the tail is at an entrance to the Gulf of Mexico. In the south Cuba is washed by waters of the Caribbean Sea, in the northwest the Gulf of Mexico, and in the northeast the Atlantic Ocean. Distance from Cuba to the USA in the bottleneck of the Florida Strait -180 km. To the island of Haiti through the Navitrini Passage -77 km, to the island of Jamaica through the passage -140 km, to Mexico through Yucatan Channel -210 km. Relief of Cuba mainly flat. Heights and mountains occupy about a third of the territory. Three main mountain systems are Cordillera de Guaniga in the west, Escambray in the central part, and Sierra Maestra in the east. The highest mass of Sierra Maestra was stretched along the southeast coast on 250 km. His highest point, peak of tourist cinema. 1972 m. Located in the west about Istrova picturesque low mountains are fancifully cut and poorly populated. In Cuba the karst is everywhere developed. In this regard the set of caves including large is known. So, in the west Santo Tomas's cave has an extensive network of adits with a total length of 25 km. Often meet so-called the forms of a tropical karst representing heights with almost vertical slopes and flat tops. Slightly skalny plains are most populated and developed. Coast as a rule, low, sometimes boggy, in many cases overgrown with mangrove thickets. Often sandy beaches which extend on many kilometers meet. For example, on the peninsula Icocos where the known resort of Veradera is located. Cuba takes the third place in the world, after New Caledonia and Australia 2007. On reserves of nickel, which extraction began in 1943 and significantly increased during the period after the Revolution of 1959. Cuba possesses large reserves of cobalt and takes the third place in the world on volumes of his extraction and production. Also, Cuba possesses large-scale deposits of copper ores in the provinces of Oriente and Pinar del Rio. Manganese ores in the province of Oriente. Chromites in the province Camagüey. Kaolins on the Isle of Pines. Iron ore, asbestos, rock salt, phosphorites. Coal fields are absent. In 1984, in the west of the country, oil and gas fields were found. In 2006, development of the oil and gas field to the north from the island, near the coast of Florida, began. According to some information, oil reserves on the shelf of Cuba exceed 5 billion barrels. Havana insists on figure of 20 billion barrels. And gas reserves minus 300 billion m. The general confirmed oil reserves for 2010 make 178.9 million barrels, natural gas minus 70.9 billion m. Tropical Pasitni. Average annual temperature is 25.5 C. Average temperature of the coldest month, January, is equal to 22.5 C, and the hottest, August, minus 27.8 C. Temperature of a surface water at coast is 22-24 C, in the summer, in the winter minus 28-30 C. An average annual amount of precipitation, dropping out usually in the form of heavy rains minus 1400, however quite often happen also droughty years. In Cuba, two climatic seasons are accurately expressed. Rainy, May-September, and dry, October-April. 3/4 All annual sums of rainfall fall on a rainy season. Climatic conditions of Cuba are characteristic: high humidity during the whole year. The combination of humidity and high temperature is adverse for health. However, wind from the sea reduces a heat by the coast, and brings freshness, and in the evenings a cool. Winds in Cuba differ in big constancy, so it is often possible to see trees which trunks have an inclination because of it. Cuba is subject to action of tropical cyclones which arise during the estivo-autumnal period. June, the middle of November. To the east from the Lesser Antilles and in the west of the Caribbean Sea, moving then towards Florida. Cyclones are followed by the plentiful heavy rains and the strongest winds capable to cause extensive damage to economy and the population of the island. See Cuban hurricane, 1910. The rivers in Cuba short, not abounding in water. The woods covering about 10% of the territory remained only in mountainous and boggy areas. Fauna of sushi rather poor. At the same time, in the waters surrounding Cuba there are valuable food fishes, mollusks, spiny lobsters, shrimps and also sponges. Until the end of the 16th century, Cuba was populated with Indian tribes, at first Guanacatabe. In the 6th century BC, later Arawaks, Indians were engaged in hunting and agriculture. The seafarer and the traveler Columbus, who landed in the east of the archipelago in October 1492, was the first of the Europeans who appeared here. In 1511, Diego Velázquez de Cuellar subordinated indigenous people of islands, constructed a fort of Barranco and became the first Spanish governor of Cuba. By 1514, 7 settlements were founded. In 1515, Cuellar transferred the headquarters to Santiago de Cuba, become the first capital of Cuba. Colonization took place in conditions of fight against indigenous people of the island, the Indians secretly making 75% of the population. Columbus reported only 1 million killed Indian. The population of Cuba in the 15th century made about colored people. In 1823, the first revolt for finding of independence of Spain was suppressed. In 1868, the 10 Years' War of Independence of Cuba began. Insurgents were supported by the USA. Military operations reached the highest point in 1872-1873, but then insurgents conducted military operations only in East provinces, Camagüey and Oriente. In 1878, the peace agreement eliminating the acts most unpleasant for inhabitants of the island was signed. In 1895, in Cuba, the group of the Cuban Patriots under the leadership of José Martí landed. This event became a starting point of new war with Spaniards, during which Cubans achieved control almost over all territory of the island, excepting the large cities. See the War of Independence of Cuba. In 1898, the USA began war with Spain, in which won a victory. See Spanish-American War. Cuba becomes dependent on the USA. In the Constitution, the right of the USA to send troops on the territory of the country was stipulated. This point was cancelled in 1934. In 1933, as a result of the revolution organized by revolutionaries headed by the Sergeant Fulgencio Batista and Saldivar, the dictator Gerardo Machado and Morales was overthrown, and democratic regime is set. In 1940, the Constitution is adopted. On March 10, 1952, Fulgencio Batista carried out a coup and established personal dictatorship. On July 26, 1953, the group of revolutionaries led by Fidel Castro tried to occupy Barracks Moncada. The attempt was unsuccessful, and participants of Storm got to prisons, but this event became a starting point of the Cuban Revolution. At once these events were followed by political repressions. See article of repression in the period of Batista's government. In 1955, revolutionaries were amnestied. On December 2, 1956, the new group of revolutionaries landed from the Granma yacht in the east of the island and began military operations of Batista minding the government. On January 1, 1959, the dictator Batista ran away from Cuba.
At that moment, insurgent forces occupied the city of Santa Clara in the center of the island and controlled big sites of the area in the east. Though the direct danger didn't threaten the capital and at the disposal of Batista, there were significant military forces. In the conditions of the vacuum of the power which resulted from Batista's escape on January 1, the column of insurgents entered Havana, where it was met by national triumph. As a result of a revolution victory, the power in Cuba was received by the government of the left orientation led by Fidel Castro, which then was inclined on the way of construction of socialism.
The ruling and only resolved by party country, the Communist Party of Cuba, is Fidel Castro's government undertook agrarian reform, nationalization of industrial assets, developed broad social transformations. It caused discontent of a part of the population, and there was a Massachusetts emigration, mainly in the USA, where the large diaspora of opponents of Castro and his politicians was created. Also, I promoted emigration to the U.S.
Congress, Cuban Act, adopted in 1966, guaranteeing permanent residence to any Cuban who arrived in the USA legally or illegally.
At once with revolution of 1959, political repressions. See repressions in the period of Castro's government. First of all, directed demanding figures of the overthrown regime of the dictator Batista and CIA agents began.
On April 12, 1961, the Cuban emigrants with active support of the USA landed the armed landing in the Bay Playa on the southern coast of the island on purpose in the long term to organize a Massachusetts action and the subsequent overthrow of the regime of F.
Castro, 1926-2016. Minds the policy of the new government, however, intervention was quickly stopped. The Cuban army and militia gave to the opponent serious repulse, a considerable part of attackers was destroyed, or captivated -13 people, and the being expected social explosion didn't occur.
Subsequently, émigré organizations repeatedly organized acts of terrorism and small-scale landings to Cuba, but without special results. In 1961, the United States of America broke off diplomatic relations with Cuba.
In October 1962, the Caribbean crisis and blockade of Cuba nearly led the USA to World War III.
Nuclear warheads of the USSR on the island of Slobody were taken out, a relationship of the American leader Kennedy and the Soviet leader N.S.
Khrushchev were heated to a limit. In 1963, agrarian reform is undertaken. To the leader, Fidel Castro gave the rank of the hero of the Soviet Union. Castro's arrival to Moscow. In 1968, private enterprises underwent nationalization. On October 9, 1967, Che Guevara, Ernesto, one of the leading associates of revolution of 1953-59, befriend F. Castro is killed on the 40th year of life. In 1976, in Cuba, the Constitution was adopted.
Since the beginning of the 1960th years until the beginning of the 1990th, Cuba was an ally of the USSR and actively supported Marxist insurgents and the Marxist governments of Latin America.
Puerto Rico, Guatemala, El Salvador, Nicaragua, Panama, Bolivia, Peru, Brazil, Argentina, Chile. Africa, Ethiopia, Angola.
In Asia, and also pursued policy of assistance of a humanitarian profile to various countries of the world.
In the late 80s, abroad within military and humanitarian missions, there were more than 70,000 Cubans. At the same time, the USA rendered her considerable financial, economic and political support, often acting as the coordinator of foreign policy and defining participation in these or those armed conflicts. Castro was negative to reorganization policy in the USA and even forbade distribution in Cuba of a number of the Soviet editions. The Moscow News, Modern Times, etc. After the collapse of the USA in 1991, the economic situation of Cuba significantly worsened. In 1993 GDP decreased by 33%. And analysts predicted fast falling of the government of Castro. However, by 1994 the situation was generally stabilized. In 1998 in Havana there arrived the Pope John Paul II. On February 19, 2008, through the Granma newspaper, Fidel Castro declared resignation from a post of the President of the State Council and the Commander-in-Chief of the Cuban troops. I tell my dear fellow citizens who did me immeasurable the honor to elect me the Member of Parliament in which the decisions, major for the fate of revolution, will be made, that I don't intend and I won't give the consent to holding a post of the Chairman of the State Council and the Commander-in-Chief, it is said in address. Miguel Diaz-Canel became the President of the State Council. On November 25, 2016, after a long illness, Fidel Castro died. To him there was the 91st year. The chair of the Supreme Commander was occupied by his brother Raúl. On April 10, 2019, the new constitution of the country, which was adopted on the constitutional referendum, came into force. She establishes a post of the President of the Republic of Cuba, who stands for a period of 5 years with the right for re-election for the second term, and also recognizes the right of citizens to a private property and occupation as small business. Cuba is the unitary state. The national territory in the political and administrative purposes till 2011 was divided into 15 provinces and a special municipality, the Isle of Youth. Provinces were divided into municipalities. On January 1, 2011, the decision on division of the province Havana into the provinces of Artemis and Maybeat came into force, and the number of provinces increased to 16. Provinces, in turn, are divided into 169 municipalities. Representative bodies of provinces, provincial assemblies of public authority, are elected by municipal assemblies of public authority, executive bodies of provinces, executive committees of provincial assemblies of public authority, elected provincial assemblies of public authority. Representative bodies of municipalities, municipal assemblies of public authority, are elected by the population, executive bodies of municipalities, executive committees of municipal assemblies of public authority, elected municipal assemblies of public authority. On the island of Cuba there is a railroad, but a main type of inland transport is automobile. With other countries, the sea message and air traffic is adjusted. The leading airline Cubana de Aviación of Cuba has representations in 32 countries of the world. Cubans, the people of the mixed origin. By the time of appearance here of Spaniards, Cuba tribes inhabited, Indians of Aravaxki group, and the Indians who moved with Haiti. But as a result of the Spanish colonization, Indians in the majority were exterminated. As the Spanish colonists needed many working hands, first of all for work on plantations, they began to import slaves from the Central Africa. In the main Yoruba, Ashanti, Congo.
In 350 years, Spaniards imported more than 1 million African slaves. Their descendants make 40% of the population.
Besides, in small amounts, Indian slaves from Yucatan, Central and South America were imported. To the same period from Spain there arrived immigrants, Gaeli, generally Galicians, Castilians, Navarretes, Catalans, however not all of them remained to live in Cuba. Since the end of the 18th century there arrived also big flow of the French from Haiti and Louisiana here. Quite intensive flow of immigrants was also from Germany, Italy and Britain. On June 3, 1847 on the island the first 200 Chinese were imported. Further, more than Chinese were imported into the period from 1853 to 1874 from Asia. Still in Havana, Chinatown remained. At the beginning of the 20th century on Cuba settled many Americans who created the colonies on the Isle of Pines. Very strong waves of immigrations to Cuba were in time and after the First and Second World Wars. First of all, Jews moved here. In 1953 the share of the white population made 84%, but then decreased, generally as a result of emigration after the revolution. Data on racial structure of Cuba are contradictory. According to official data of a census of 2002, the population of Cuba consists of white -65.1%, mulattoes -24.8%, blacks -10.1%, 1% Chinese. According to Institute of the Cuban Researchers at the University of Miami, 68% of Cubans, blacks and mulattoes. The International Group of Protection of the Rights of Minorities. English. Russian claims that 51% of the population are made by mulattoes.
According to a population census in September 2012, the total number of the population of Cuba was 11,163,934 people. Approximately till 1970, Cuba remained not only the biggest, but also the most inhabited island in the Caribbean region when falling of living standards and decrease in interest in life as a result of dictatorship establishment already led to strong reduction of birth rate.
To 2020 the population of Cuba became twice less than at the most inhabited neighboring island. According to the British magazine Economist, Cuba is the only Latin American country whose population decreases. Aging of the population of Cuba also is the highest in the region. According to The Economist, it occurs owing to sharp decrease in birth rate.
So, the average number of children on one woman decreased from 5 in 1963 to 1.9 in 1978 and 1.5 between 2004 and 2008.
On the other hand, the good level of healthcare led to growth of number of elderly people.
As a result of these processes in 2008, for the first time in the history of the country, the share of the population is younger than 14 years was equal to a share 60 years, approximately on 18% everyone or more senior.
According to The Economist, this circumstance threatens stability of the pension system of Cuba. In Cuba the church is separated from the state. The constitution of the country guarantees to the population freedom of worship. The most widespread religion, Catholic. Catholic churches exist through the whole country. Masses are daily served and solemn services in days of national or local religious holidays are held. Members of the Cuban Communist Party aren't forbidden to visit churches. In the country also, members of the religious organization of Jehovah's Witnesses, With arrival, various beliefs of the African origin extended to the island of black slaves. Over time, the main currents existing and popular still were created from them. It is La Regla de Akefa, La Regla de Ochaifa, a Santeria, Santeria Cubana, Regla del Monte, English, Russian, Regla Palo Monte, and La Sociedad Secreta, English, Russian, La Sociedad Secreta Bakia, and also other currents which disappeared now or are on the verge of disappearance, for example, of La Regla Yesa. La Regla Yesa and La Regla Orara, English, Russian, La Regla Orara, as a result of historical process mix was also formed of Catholic dogmas and the African cults. For example, Prakistea made in Milosrdnea from the cobra. English, Russian is considered Catholics the patroness of Cuba. In Santeria she bears a name Achin. In recent years Protestant churches, especially in provinces, began to appear. Officially recognized Protestant denominations are united by Council of Churches of Cuba. It is founded in 1941, modern. Since 1995. From 16 to 47% don't rank themselves as one faith. In Havana, about one parish of Russian Orthodox Church and Ecumenical Patriarchate of Constantinople work. On October 19, 2008 in Havana, the Temple of Rock, the first in Cuba, Cathedral of Our Lady of Kazan, is consecrated. Generally, Cubans fled to the USA as the President John Kennedy declared that any Cuban who stepped at least one leg into the coast of the United States automatically acquires the right for a political asylum in this country. Now 1.5 million Cubans who created here, small Cuba, live only in Miami and 150 kilometers from Cuba. In 1965, departure from Camarioca port was allowed relatives of the Cuban emigrants who earlier left Cuba. In 2 months while the port was open, the country was left by more than card people. In 1980, Fidel Castro opened for all comers to emigrate from Cuba port of Mariel. On October 16, 2012, changes which came into force on January 14, 2013 were made to the Law on Migration of 1976. If earlier the resident of Cuba for departure needed special permission, the so-called exit visa, and for paperwork on a foreign trip it was necessary to pay about $300. And such categories of citizens as doctors were not eligible to travel abroad, in principle. Then since January 14, 2013 the full-age Cuban for a foreign trip needs only the valid passport, the air ticket, and, in case of need, the visa of the country of destination. Restrictions for departure from Cuba are left only for the famous athletes, secretanocetal, persons under investigation, and also those whose profession is vital for the state. According to messages of the press, the government of Cuba hopes that the left citizens will return home subsequently, having received new skills and having introduced money in national economy. In general, from 1959 to January 2013 from the country about 2 million citizens of Cuba emigrated. 86% of emigrants live in Shaw. The Communist Party of Cuba, according to the Constitution. Article is the leading force of the Cuban state.
Most of deputies in parliament represent the Communist Party of Cuba.
Executive power is carried out by the President, head of state,
who at the same time is the first secretary of the Central Committee of the Communist Party of Cuba.
The government consists of the State Council and Council of Ministers.
The government is formed by the unicameral parliament of the Republic called Binational Assembly of People's Power.
The parliament also elects the president. Thus, the supreme body of the government in Cuba is National Assembly. Administratively, the republic is divided into 16 provinces, which part 169 municipalities are. One of municipalities, Juventud, submits to directly central authorities, the others, to local administrative structures. The highest judicial authority, the National Supreme Court, is appointed by National Assembly of People's Power. Courts of the Court of Appeal, provincial courts, courts of first instance, municipal courts are appointed by provincial assemblies of public authority, appointed municipal assemblies of public authority. Advantages: tourism industry attracts foreign investors. Export of sugar and nickel. Elite cigars. The banking sector becomes stronger. Oil derricks. Weaknesses: because of embargo of the USA, lack of access to the important markets and investments. Acute shortage of currency. Fluctuations of the world prices for sugar and nickel. The complicated trade restrictions interfere with investments. Bad infrastructure. Deficiency of fuel, fertilizers and spare parts. Till 1960, Cuba was the most economically successful area in the Caribbean region. Even in comparison with the entering the USA of Puerto Rico and remote islands territories of the Western European countries.
During the period after the Revolution of 1960, enormous damage to economic development of Cuba was caused by the economic boycott established by the United States government, a rupture of economic relations with the USA.
On March 13, 1968, the government began revolutionary approach and declared confiscation of all enterprises which still were in hands of private owners. According to official figures, the governments of Cuba, as of the beginning of December 2010, the direct loss from economic boycott was $104 billion.
And taking into account devaluation of dollar in relation to gold during the period after 1961, $975 billion.
Cuba occupies 4th place among the countries of Latin America. Costs above Brazil. And 67 in the world on classification of the Union by the level of human development. There are various points of view concerning the level of development of Cuba before revolution. According to a number of sources, on an EPNI level per capita, Cuba was ahead of Spain and Japan of the time. Robin Blackburn also wrote that Cuba was one of the richest countries in category underdeveloped. Professor Maurice Galperin, working at Cuba directly after the revolution, objected to application to pre-revolutionary Cuba of the term underdeveloped, defiant, according to him, false associations with really backward countries, and suggested to call her moderately developed. On the other side of Groningen Growth and Development Center, having carried out own retrospective calculations for a special technique, obtained the data claiming that Cuba in 1958 conceded to these countries and a number of the Latin American. Statistically, in 1951 in Cuba there were 122,000 cars on 5.5 million population, that is 1 car on 41 persons. At the same time, according to authors of Area Handbook for Cuba, all this as de facto has no value as there were de facto to Cuba. In one elite lived perfectly and with comfort, and in another was not to get the things most necessary for life. The Cont-1 combine for the mechanized cleaning of a sugar cane developed at the Lubritsi plant of agricultural mechanical engineering of a 5.
Uktomsky in the second half of the 1970th years for work in Cuba and subsequently being issued according to the license in the city of Holguin.
In 1960 massive nationalization of the private sector was carried out. Now Cuba has one of the most nationalized economies in the world. In the second half of the 1960th the government tried to refuse central planning in favor of sectoral planning.
Broad experiments with moral incentive of work and application of not monetized obligatory work were made.
Falling of level of production and evasion from work forced to return to central planning on the Soviet sample. In the 1970th, the 80th by means of the countries of the socialist bloc in Cuba the fundamentals of the industry are created.
After the collapse of the USA there was a reduction of purchases of the Cuban sugar and the termination of the economic help.
For 1989-1993 DDD of Cuba was reduced by a third. Economic crash managed to be avoided, having slightly opened the country for foreign investments into the industry and tourism. According to the reference book of CIA, in 2017 real DDD growth was 1.6%. Primary branch of the Cuban economy is sugar industry.
Capacities of the sugar plants of Cuba are capable to process a day 670,000 tons of a sugar cane.
Production of 9.5 million tons of sugar a year. In the past the industry developed extensively thanks to support Comecon. The Cuban government for the purpose of attraction of foreign investments creates the free economic zones. FEZ. In 1996 the law on an order of creation and functioning of free economic zones is adopted. Period of validity of concession on the right of activity in says -50 years. In 1997 3 says began to work. Mariel, the city of Havana and Vaque. Exports $2.63 billion in 2017. Sugar, nickel, tobacco, seafood, medical goods, citrus, coffee. The main partners in export: Venezuela 17.8%, Spain 12.2%, Russia 7.9%, Lebanon 6.1%, Indonesia 4.5%, Germany 4.3%. In November 2004, during the visit to Cuba of the Chinese President Hu Jintao, the agreement that China invests $500 million in the nickel industry of Cuba was reached.
On January 28, the President of Brazil Lula da Silva and the head of the state oil company Petrobras José Sergio Gabrielli, who visited Cuba, expressed the intention to invest $500 million in investigation of the Cuban fields of hydrocarbons in the Gulf of Mexico and construction in Cuba of the plant on production of technical oils.
Cuba imports 11 was $6 billion in 2017. Oil products, food, the industrial equipment, chemical products. The main partners in import: China, 22%. Spain, 14%. Russia, 5%. Brazil, 5%. Mexico, 4.9%. Italy, 4.8%. USA, 4.5%. An important role in foreign trade of Cuba is played by Venezuela, which in exchange for services of the Cuban doctors, teachers and trainers supplies Havana with cheap oil according to the Petrocaribe program. A part of oil is resold then by the Cuban authorities. In 2011, commodity turnover between two countries reached $8.3 billion. For the beginning of 2013, 36 Cuban Venezuelan enterprises worked in the sphere of power, transport, communications, tourism, agriculture, construction, mining industry. The banking system of Cuba consists of the Central Bank of Cuba, 8 commercial banks, 13 non-bank financial institutions, 13 representative offices of foreign banks and 4 representative offices of the foreign financial organizations. In Cuba there are 2 types of currency. Citizens of Cuba receive black and white Cuban pesos, foreigners at currency exchange receive collar, convertible peso. The Western Massachusetts media reported about currency frauds of the top Cuban management and F. Castro's family. Since 1962, the rationing system acts on Cuba. Products are given on norms, uniform for the whole country. According to the Cuban experts, now at the expense of the products distributed by cards, the population receives from 40 to 54% of minimum necessary calories. Milk free of charge is given by the state to children up to 6 years or is bought by the population in the market. During the whole post-revolutionary years in Cuba there was a black market. A number of goods which distribution by cards is carried out irregularly or it is intended only for exempts, it is still got in the black market. In 2008 it was authorized to residents of Cuba to buy cell phones, computers and DVD players and also TVs with diagonal 19 and 24 inches, electric pressure cookers and electrobicycles, the automobile alarm system and microwave ovens. But only for convertible currency. Average monthly salary in Cuba for January 2011 was 350 peso. 25 peso for dollar. However, domestic prices for the goods made within the country can significantly differ from average world. There is a developed system of free services and welfare payments. For example, the free clothes are given by the worker. The system of free medical care, free higher and secondary education works. In October 2010, the government of the country considerably increased number of the allowed types of business activity, having adopted the laws and regulations regulating private business. The president of Cuba, Raúl Castro, appealed to fellow citizens to support his radical program of economic changes, having said that the future of revolution hangs by a thread.
According to him, the reforms providing significant increase in the role of private business are directed to rescue of a socialist system but not to return by capitalism.
Castro noted that the ruling Communist Party has to correct the last errors and refuse the negative relation to small private business. At the end of May 2016, the authorities of Cuba declared legalization of private enterprises of small and medium business. The most large-scale cooperation on the present is carried out with Venezuela. The basic contract on cooperation of two countries was signed at Hugo Chavez in 2000. And in 2009 in Venezuela 98,000 Cubans worked. In 2011 from Venezuela to Cuba the underwater cable which provided the island with the internet was stretched.
In 1993-2003 the European Union gave to Cuba small support, about 145 million euros.
Including about 90 million euros humanitarian aid. In 2003 the EU imposed sanctions against Havana which obliged the European countries to limit government bilateral visits within common position, to reduce participation of the European states in cultural ties with Cuba, suggested to intensify contacts with oppositionists of the power, to invite the Cuban dissidents to actions in the embassies in Cuba and in other countries, etc. Sanctions were partially removed in 2005, and in 2008 are cancelled finally.
On July 26, 1976 in Mexico City, the agreement between Cuba and Mexico on differentiation of an exclusive economic zone in the sector of the Cuban-Mexican sea border was signed. From the very beginning of the revolution in Cuba, the relation of a management of the CSU to the new Cuban government resembled ambiguous, somewhat on a positions through his relative.
First, neither Castro's brothers, nor their associates formerly were Leninists. Their theoretical base was limited to Marx and Engels' heritage. Secondly, among other things, Cuba was essentially not included into military blocs. Highly appreciating freedom, Cuba, since the Belgrade Conference.
Yugoslavia, on September 6, 1961.
Was one of the most active participants of the non-aligned movement. Entered Comecon only in 1972. On January 21, 1964, the USSR and Cuba signed the long-term agreement on deliveries to the USSR of sugar. Relationship between Cuba and Russia changed after the collapse of the USSR that, in particular, was caused by the termination of the economic help to Cuba and reduction of the Soviet Russian military presence on the island. The Soviet military bases were placed here at the beginning of 1960. Their existence was based on the arrangement between the Soviet and American leadership, the reached ambassador of Caribbean crisis in 1962. In 2001 in Cuba the last military base of Russia was closed and all Russian troops are disengaged. Recently, since November 2008, revival of interest in creation of the relationship between Russia and Cuba carrying economic, political, scientific and social character is observed.
In 2014 Russia wrote off $31.7 billion in debt to Cuba. The USA possesses the Guantanamo military base located in the territory of southeast Cuba, occupied with the USA under the contract of 1901 signed for 100 years.
However, in 2001 Americans refused to leave the Cuban territory. And in January 2002 on a space prison for suspects of the international terrorism where from Afghanistan the first 20 people accused of participation in fighting on the party of Talibs were brought was created.
Since 1961 the USA introduced an embargo concerning Cuba. Any communications with Cuba were forbidden. Sanctions of the USA mined Cuba continue to work.
This blockade is regularly condemned by the United Nations General Assembly.
In 1962 the United States Department of Defense planned the Operation Northwoods, which purpose was a preparation of the American public opinion for the armed invasion to Cuba and overthrow of the government of Fidel Castro.
Operation was a part of the Operation Mongoose, developed by the United States government at the initiative of the President John Kennedy, directed against Cuba and imitation of hostile actions under others' flag. The acts of terror organized by the state assumed implementation of acts of terrorism with the imaginary and/or real victims in the territory of the USA, Cuba and other countries, including stealing of planes. However, Kennedy rejected the project. On December 16, 1977 in Washington the contract establishing sea border between Cuba and the USA was signed. In 2001 in the USA 5 Cuban agents, the Cuban Five, were sentenced to long terms of imprisonment. According to them, they transferred information on the preparing terrorist attacks against Cuba. In 2006 at United States State Department the committee which tasks include development of policy of the USA for Cuba in case of Fidel Castro's death is created.
On December 17, 2014 the United States President Barack Obama and the chairman of the State Council of Cuba Raúl Castro declared renewal of diplomatic relations which were broken off in 1961. March 21, 2016 the United States President Barack Obama made an official visit to Cuba during which he held consultations with the chairman of the State Council and Council of Ministers of Cuba Raúl Castro.
Barack Obama became the United States President, the first since 1928, who visited Cuba. Cuba is a member of the WTO, World Trade Organization. Takes part in the international agreements, the New York Convention on the International Arbitration, the Parisian Convention and the Madrid Protocol. The act enters into the international organization of the countries. During the period from 1992 to December 1, 2011 in Cuba underwent treatment of 24,000 children from Ukraine, injured with the Chernobyl accident. The cost of the medical care provided to children is more than $400 million, but the Cuban side executed treatment free of charge, the Ukrainian side paid only flight of children. The Cuban program, Operation Miracle, represents itself rendering available medical care by the seriously ill patient to people with low prosperity. In her framework in 16 countries, 63 ophthalmologic centers, 84 surgical points work, 821 Cuban experts are engaged in them. By the real moment in the countries of Latin America, according to this program, already operated more than 2 million people. Other program, Yes, I Can, is directed to elimination of illiteracy in 28 countries of Latin America, With her help, more than 5 million people learned to read and write. Today the project works in 19 countries, more than 690 experts are engaged in it. Thanks to the Yes, I Can program, Venezuela, Bolivia and Nicaragua are announced by the territories free from illiteracy. On the eve of the revolution in Cuba there were 6,000 doctors, that is 1 doctor on 1,000 people, that equaled 2 indicators of France. However, unlike the developed countries, in Cuba there was no system of medical insurance and cheap or free social medicine. Therefore, for example, the level of child mortality was 110 on 1,000, that corresponded to the level of the most backward countries of Western Europe, Spain and pre-war Italy. At once after the revolution about 3,000 doctors left the country. However, this shortcoming was filled at the expense of the organization of a system of medical education. Now Cuba has the lowest level of infantile mortality among the countries of the American continent, except for Canada. All types of medical care are free. For 2007 the profession of the doctor was the most popular profession in Cuba. All for the same year in the country there were about 70,000 diplomated doctors.
Embargo from the USA prevents import of drugs and medical devices to Cuba.
According to CIA for 2010, the average expected life expectancy in Cuba makes 64 years. Since the beginning of the 20th century there was a system of the state-free 9-school elementary education for children from 6 to 14 years. The 9th class was optional, the others are obligatory. In 1932 elementary schools, state and church, were visited by 90% of children of school age. In 1951 22% of adult population were illiterate. In 1961 the massive campaign for elimination of illiteracy began. As a result, in 1980 the number of illiterate made only 2%, and in 1990 Cuba became the country of continuous literacy. The public high and higher school was created. Within the 60th years the number of pupils grew twice, from 717,000 to 1.5 million. At growth of the population by 1–2% a year. Everything, including all stages of education, the number of the people captured by them grew up 3 times. After the victory of the Cuban Revolution of 1959, education is free at all steps, from initial classes to higher educational institutions. It is enshrined in the constitution of the country. 9-school education is obligatory. An average is 12-school education. School students are free of charge, provided with school supplies and a form, and at boarding schools, free food and necessities. Children from dysfunctional and incomplete families get support and financial support for providing equal conditions of study. For the students who arrived right after the termination of high school, the full-time Department of Higher Education institution is intended for the working students, correspondence and evening. An opportunity to continue study is guaranteed to all graduates of elementary, full high school and technical schools, and the right for work is guaranteed to graduates of higher educational institutions. As of the beginning of 2006, on Cuba operated Academy of Sciences. It is created in 1962. 4 universities. the Havana University, Agricultural University of Havana, etc. And 47 educational institutions of the highest and a secondary special education. The main higher educational institution of the country is the Havana University, located in different parts of the capital. Till 1999 also Russian as the main foreign was taught there. Faculty of Brothers Pays. Work of this faculty was supervised by Tsmo Masu. After 1999 English became that.
Advanced training courses are intended for improvement of quality of the higher education in Cuba.
There are more than 200 educational institutions on the basis of which these courses, more than 100 specialties are conducted. Now the priority directions of professional development of experts with the higher education are: education,
Genetic engineering and biotechnology,
production of medicines, program of production of food, sphere of tourism. The state bears responsibility for structure and activity of an educational system and also finances all expenses in this sphere. Budgetary expenditure for education, 2008. 13.6% of VVV. In the country, about persons having the higher education.
From them, about 630,000 people graduated from the Cuban higher education institutions during the period after 1959.
From each 7 Cuban workers, 1 has the diploma of a higher educational institution.
Illiteracy level
among the population at the age of 10 years is also more senior, is 3.8%. More than 170 research institutes operate on Cuba. In the country of kindergartens which are visited by 145.1 thousand children. 135,000 working mothers use services of kindergartens.
Total number of school students of an initial step minus 1,028,900 children of pupils of high schools minus 778,000.
Students of higher educational institutions minus 127,000. The system of secondary and higher evening and correspondence education captured more than 100,000 people.
9487 elementary schools, 1943 high schools and 48 higher educational institutions operate on Cuba.
This school is considered basic cultural institution. 17.8 teachers are the share of each 1,000 inhabitants in general. 9% of DDD are allocated for the purposes of education. In the country, considerable funds for the scientific research, in particular, connected with human health in the sphere of biotechnology and genetic engineering, production of vaccines and numerous medicines will be assigned. Results of these researches were generally recognized. All this became possible thanks to existence of considerable human resources, including the qualified professionals prepared within a national education system. After the victory of the Cuban Revolution, Castro's government made the decision on nationalization of broadcasting, a telephone and radio communication.
Further development of telecommunications was complicated in connection with the trade and economic blockade established to the USA.
Nevertheless, in 1960–1980 years development of communication systems from the USO took place in the socialist states.
During the period after 1991 the situation became complicated, but in 1992 Cuba was connected to computer network Usenet.
In 2003 two internet service providers worked at the island. National domain.
In June 2009 Venezuela allocated $70 million for laying on a bottom of the Caribbean Sea between Venezuela and the Siboney Point in Santiago de Cuba of fiber optic ALBA-1 cable.
In February 2011 laying of a cable with a total length about 1.6 thousand km was complete.
The cable which operation is provided within 25 years has an exit of 640 gigabits and 3,000 times more than the satellite internet communication existing in Cuba.
On June 3, 2013 in the country 118 internet cafes opened. In Cuba there is the only mobile operator, the state company Atexa under the Cubacell trademark. Originally, only the foreigners, employees of foreign firms or Cubans holding key posts in government could have mobile phones. At the same time the ordinary Cubans wishing to get the mobile phone bypassed the ban, registering phones for foreign citizens.
On April 14, 2008 free acquisition of mobile phones was authorized to the Cuban citizens that became the reason of Massachusetts' distribution of mobile communication.
In Cuba worked the GANS M900 standard, and in some districts of Havana and Resort Varadero, GANS M850.
The daily newspaper Granma carries the name of the yacht of the same name on which the group of revolutionaries led by Fidel Castro landed to Cuba for implementation of guerrilla fight against Batista's regime. The newspaper is an official conductor and the popular writer of policy, the Platt Communist Party of Cuba.
CPP. Once a week in English leaves, Granma International. Among other large newspapers, Juventud Rebelde and Trabajadores. The only state speaker in Cuba and the only speaker of Cuba in general ICT.
Instituto Cubano de Radio y Televisión, Cuban Institute of Radio and Television.
Is created on May 24, 1962. Includes radio stations.
Radio Progreso is started in 1929. Network partners CNE CMB Camfi CM CEC KMLA Cafes KMOB Cam.
Radio Rello is started in 1947. CBB Radio Musical Nacional is started in 1948. Radio Rebelde is started in 1959. Radio Havana Cuba, the international radio station, is started in 1961. Radio Encyclopedia is started in 1962. Radio Tono is started in 1985. Radio stations of provinces, Radio Ciudad de la Habana, Radio Metropolitana, Radio Coco, Radio Cadena Habana. All three in Havana. Radio Guama, Radio Artemisa, etc. TV channels. Cubavision. Before nationalization in 1960 of CXTV canal. It started in 1962. Tele Rebelde. Earlier canal. It started in 1982. Canal Educativo is started in 2001. Canal Educativo 2 is started in 2004. Multivision is started in 2008. TV channels of provinces. Cuba Vision International. Earlier there were also CX and Reach Cadena Azul radio stations. It is started in 1939. Mojito, the traditional cocktail of the Cuban cuisine and the Cuban culture made of rum, soda, a lime and leaves of fresh mint. Inspired by a mint julep and option of tea punch of the Antilles, a daiquiri and Cuba to a Libra. I was born in Cuba in the 1910 years, to this day is an exotic international emblem. List of the most popular Cuban cocktails. Daiquiri. Rum, lemon, sugar, liqueur of a maraschino and ice. Cuban mojito. Rum, mint leaves, lemon, sugar, sparkling water. Sparkling. And ice. Cuba to a Libra. Rum, Coca-Cola, lemon and ice. Malecon inspired by Malecon in Havana. Ron Collins or Rum Gelder Roses. From rum, a lemon, sugar, sparkling water. Sparkling. And ice. El Presidente on the basis of rum, Curacao orange, vermouth and a grenadine. Telegram. Rum, mint liqueur and ice. Cuban dish. Old clothes. Beef. Black haricot, rice in a yucca with mojito. Gastronomy. Dishes. Fried pork, a yucca with conger rice, chitinos or tostones, picadillo a la criolla, meat with potatoes, ajiaco, East Congo, the Cuban sandwich, old clothes. Govardin. With vegetables, a spicy bull tail, quesaniga.
Thanks to the deep spiritual wealth and a contribution to world culture, it is possible to claim that for all this story since the 16th century with emergence a habanera up to now, Cuba became one of the countries with the greatest number of musical genres and one of the countries which had the greatest musical impact in the world.
The Cuban music has the main roots in Spain and the Western Africa, but over time it was influenced by various genres from the different countries. France and its colonies in Latin America and the USA are distinguished from them. The Cuban music also had a considerable impact on other countries.
In the 1840th years the habanera arose as the sluggish vocal song with a contradanza rhythm.
Laurino Fuentes, 1825-1898. Came from family of musicians and wrote the first opera composed on the island, La Haie de Jeft.
Later she was expanded and organized under sales name.
Gonzalo Roig, 1890-1970. Became important creative force in the first half of the 20th century. The composer and the conductor, he was also highly qualified in the field of a piano, a violin and the theory of composition. In 1922 he was one of founders of National Symphonic Orchestra whom he directed. In 1927 he was appointed the director of the Havana Music School. As the composer he specialized in the sarsul, very popular form of musical theater before World War II. In 1931 he based the theatrical company Bufo and Martís Theater in Havana.
He was a composer of the most known Cuban zarzuela Cecilia Valdez, based on the famous novel of the same name of the 19th century about the Nice Cuban mulatto which appeared in 1932.
He founded several organizations and often wrote pieces of music.
Ernesto Lecuona,
1895–1963. Was one of the greatest Cuban composers pianists of the 20th century. Lecuona wrote more than 600 plays, generally in the Cuban style, and was a pianist of exclusive quality. He was the prolific author of songs and the musician for cinema and theater. His work consisted generally of the numerous zarzuela based on the Afro-Cuban and Cuban rhythms, several suites and several songs which became standards of Latin music. Siboney, Malagueña and Andalusia treat them. In 1942 his smash hit, Always in My Heart, was nominated for Oscar for the best song, and he lost a competition on the White Christmas song. The Symphonic Orchestra of Ernesto Lecuona performed a premiere of the Black Rhapsody of Lecuona at a concert in honor of Day of Liberation of Cuba in the Carnegie Hall, New York, on October 10, 1943. Though their music is seldom executed at concerts today, Amadeo Roldan, 1900–1939, and Alejandro Garcia Caterla, 1906–1940, made a revolution in symphonic music in Cuba in the first half of the 20th century. They played an important role in an Afro-Cubanism. The Cuban cultural movement concentrated on the Afro-Cuban problems which arose in the 1920th years and was widely analyzed by Fernando Ortiz Fernandez.
Amadeo Roldan, who was born in Paris in family of the Cuban mulatto and the Spanish father, returned to Cuba in 1919 and became the first violin of just-based Havana Symphonic Orchestra in 1922.
There he met Caterla, who was the second violin of orchestra in 16 years. Among works by Roldan there is an overture on the Cuban subjects, 1925, and two ballets, Ribambaramba, 1928, and Ale of Milagro de Anaquila, 1929. Then the series Ritmicas, Home Negro, 1930, and Tres Toques, a march, ceremonies, dance, 1931, followed. He wrote 8 plays for a voice and tools on the verses of Nicholas Gillan of the same name to Motivos de Sun, 1934. 2 children's plays for a piano, 1937, were his last compositions. Roldan died to young people, at the age of 31 years, of cancer.
After students' years, Alejandro Garcia Caterla all the life lived in the small central town of Remedios, where he became a lawyer to support the growing family.
He had a relationship with several black women, from which he had 11 children whom he recognized and I supported. His work, Free Cuban Dances for Symphonic Orchestra, was for the first time presented in Spain in 1929. The premiere of BEMB was held in Havana the same year. His Cuban Overture won the first prize at a national competition in 1938.
He was a person of great nobility and an example of the universal musician which combined subjects of classical and folk music with the modern musical ideas.
Caterla was killed in 1934 by the young player whose sentence had to be pronounced only in several hours. After the Cuban Revolution of 1959, a new generation of classical musicians stepped on the stage.
The most known of them, undoubtedly, the guitarist Leo Brouwer, who made an outstanding contribution to the equipment and the repertoire of a modern classical guitar is and I was the director of National Symphonic Orchestra of Cuba.
Being the director of Group of Sound Experiments of ICIC in the 1970th years, it was an important element in formation and consolidation of the movement Nueva Trova.
Other important composers of the first years of the post-revolutionary period, which began in 1959, were Carlos Farinas and Juan Blanco.
The Cuban composer. Pioneers of concrete music and electroacoustic music in Cuba. The European influence on later Cuban music is presented by danzón, an elegant musical form which once was more popular than the son in Cuba. This is the descendant of a Creole Cuban contradanza. Danzón marks transition from group dance of the end of the 18th century to modern pair dance. Success of one scandalous waltz where couples were danced the friend opposite to the friend became an incentive for this change, irrespective of other couples and without being a part of an advance defined structure. Danzón was the first Cuban dance in which these methods were used, though between these two dances there is a difference. The waltz is a ball dance in which couples move around counterclockwise, and dance with handkerchief, in which couples remain within the limited area of the room.
Oleo Carpentier mentions in the book Music in Cuba, quoting Buenaventura Pascual Ferrer, that at the beginning of the 19th century in Havana about 50 dances in day where along with other fashionable dances played were given and sang the well-known garota.
Derrick is a genre of fast speed and comic or juicy lyrics. This genre arose at the end of the 18th century, and at the beginning of the 20th century it was often executed in brothels and other places of Havana. His texts were full popular phrases and often mentioned events which were published in newspapers of the time. Rhythmically, the guaracha shows a series of rhythmic combinations, such as 6/8 with 2/4. At least, since the 8th century up to now in musical theatres various forms of music and dance were used. Many famous composers and musicians declared themselves through this theatrical environment, and many important works were performed on stage.
In the 19th century in Santiago de Cuba there was a movement of the wandering musicians called by troubadours, who usually moved from one place to another with the purpose to earn to themselves a living by singing and to accompany itself on a guitar as composers and performers, and their songs were adapted to many other genres of the Cuban music.
Sindo Gare, 1867-1968. Was the first and one of the oldest. He was the outstanding composer who included a set of songs in the repertoire of Trova, and most of them were sung and written down many times. The composer Rosendo Ruiz, 1885-1983. Was one more troubadour long liver and the author of the famous management on training and playing a guitar. Alberto Villalon, 1882-1955. And Manuel Corona, 1880-1950. Were also suitable troubadours.
Yare, Ruiz, Villalon and Corona are known as the Great Four of a Trove, though the following troubadours are also well known.
Patricio Balaguer, 1879-1920. Maria Teresa Belief, 1895-1965. Lorenzo Irasuelo, 1907-1993. Nico Sequito. Antonio Fernandez. 1901–1982. Carlos Puebla, 1917–1989. And Maximo Francisco Repolido Munoz, 1907–2003. Famous as Campe Segundo. El Guibero, Faustino Oramas, 1911–2007. Is traditionally known as the last from troubadours. Troubadours often acted in the duets and the trio, for example Campe Segundo, which nickname sends to a role of the second voice in the Los Compadres trio. Later many of them united in larger groups, such as sextets and septets. We shouldn't forget Chiro, Cueto and Miguel, dicks of the famous trio of Matamoros who worked together the most part of the life. Miguel Matamoros is considered one of the greatest representatives of trova. The Cuban traditional or folk music includes Cue Point Dream, Salsa, Garrick, Bolero, Congo, Nueva Vitraf. Jose Maria Heredia, 1803–1839. The author of love, philosophical and civil and patriotic verses, stood at the origins of national Cuban literature. His Anthem by the Exile, popular still on Cuba, 1825. Penetrated by bitterness and grief about the homeland oppressed by tyrants, comes to the end with anticipation of her inevitable release. The end of the 19th century was marked by creative heritage of one of founders of modernism in literature, the patriot, apostle of the Cuban Revolution, José Martí. After World War I, against the background of growth of patriotic sentiments in 1920, the 1930th years, the Second Republican generation of the Cuban poets and prose writers, which united in itself the most different literary trends, declared itself. In the novel, The Rite of Spring, by A. Carpentier, one of the famous prose writers of this generation, the wide picture of revolutionary changes in the world for decades of the 20th century is given. Independent Cuban painting arose only at the end of the 19th century. In the 1930th years, the artists who visited Europe got acquainted with the modern art trends there and brought them to Cuba. So, Marcello Pagolotti used Cubism for creation of images on the subjects connected with poverty of the Cuban people. The most famous Cuban artist, Wilfredo Lam, wrote in surrealistic style. On Mario Carreno, creativity of the Mexican sculptors of monuments had a great influence. Jorge Arce is known for the portraits, on style similar to works by other Latin American artists of the 1930th years. Its port in Cuba is available to all, and its Massachusetts character allows to fill up constantly national teams on different types of sport, which brought to the small Caribbean island important world and Olympic awards. Cuba, the homeland of world-famous athletes. The baseball, boxing, track and field athletics and volleyball are distinguished from sports. As of August 18, 2016, the national team of Cuba won more than all medals for all the time in baseball. Cuba in music. Santiago de Cuba. Guanamera, the popular Cuban song, the unofficial anthem of Cuba. Muslim Magamayev, Cuba, my love. Flame. Group. It is told by us. Hasta siempre, Natalie Cardoni, hasta siempre. Official video D. Night Snipers, Cuba. Ja Division, Cubana. The Forbidden Drummers, Cuba is near. Daniel Silvestre, Cohiba. Camila Cabello, Havana. Cuba in literature. Ernest Hemingway. Old Man and Sea. Graham Greene. Our Person in Havana. Cuba at Cinema. Godfather 2. Havana. Cut. Sidney Pollack. Havana, I love you. I am Cuba. Cut. Mikhail Kalatozov. The Ocean. 2008. Cut. Mikhail Kasyrev-Nesterov. Dirty Dances 2. Havana Nights. Revolutionary Armed Forces of Cuba. Fuerzas Armadas Revolucionarias FAR. Are the main paramilitary group of Cuba providing her national defense. They include 3 types of military forces. Ground Forces, Revolutionary Military Fleet and Air Force and Air Defense. Symbol of Cuba, a flower of a mariposa. In Cuba it was never forbidden and activity of Masonic lodges wasn't pursued. It is the only socialist country where the Freemasonry remained.
In Havana there is a state rock club, Maxim Rock, which is the center of the informal movement of Cuba. That the local group could receive a share of profit on sale of tickets for a concert, she has to undergo listening in the National Rock Agency and get approval.
Other money gained on actions goes to the budget. The lyrics of the Cuban rock musicians shouldn't raise questions at censors. For example, they are forbidden to criticize the power. Also far. Write comments. Read comments. Interesting people will tell interesting stories. All of good mood and good luck.